In this gripping story about racism in America, Dr. Langston Reed, a respected black heart surgeon, becomes the target of a corrupt and racist police officer, Officer Daniels, in a small town. What starts as a routine encounter escalates into a humiliating and infuriating series of injustices, exposing deep-rooted prejudice and abuse of power. Despite his status and accomplishments, Langston is treated with suspicion, disrespect, and hostility simply because of his race. As the situation spirals, the story highlights the infuriating reality of systemic racism and the emotional toll it takes, leaving viewers both enraged and deeply engaged. The wind carried a warm, dry breeze as Nicholas Turner stepped onto the cracked pavement of Willow Creek's town square. The late afternoon sun painted the rows of mom-and-pop stores in a golden hue, their faded awnings swaying lazily. To a passerby, Nicholas looked like any other man enjoying a quiet walk, a broad-shouldered figure in a simple gray t-shirt and worn jeans, his face hidden beneath the brim of a baseball cap. But Nicholas was not just any man. He was one of the wealthiest real estate developers in the state, with multi-million-dollar projects spanning 3 cities. Willow Creek was his newest focus, a sleepy town with untapped potential and businesses begging for revival. Nicholas had already purchased several properties here, though few knew his name or face. That's how he liked it, blending in, watching, listening. Today's visit was different. He wasn't here as a CEO or investor. He wanted to see how the town treated people who looked like him. Nicholas, a black man who'd climbed every mountain life placed in front of him, knew firsthand how assumptions and prejudice thrived in small-town America. Willow Creek wasn't immune. He'd already heard whispers, comments from business owners about keeping the clientele exclusive and the kind of people we don't need here. Nicholas was here to see it for himself. His first stop was Harper Sons Hardware, an old brick building with faded signage and dirty glass windows. He pushed open the heavy door, and a small bell jingled. Inside, the faint scent of sawdust and motor oil greeted him. The aisles were cluttered but tidy, with tools and supplies stacked high. A middle-aged man with a balding head stood behind the counter, his round glasses slipping down his nose as he studied an inventory list. "Afternoon," Nicholas said casually as he approached. The man barely looked up. "Can I help you?" Nicholas picked up a drill bit set from the counter, turning it over in his hands. "I'm looking to pick up a few supplies, tools for renovating some properties. Are these the only sets you carry?" The man, Harper, according to his name tag, finally looked at Nicholas, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Those are our mid-range options. What exactly are you renovating?" "Some homes just off Maple," Nicholas replied, keeping his tone light. Harper's lips thinned. "Maple? That's not the best part of town. Surprised anyone's investing there." Nicholas smiled faintly. "Seems like a place with potential." "Potential for who?" Harper muttered under his breath, but loud enough for Nicholas to catch. He straightened, clearing his throat. "Well, if you're looking for supplies, maybe something cheaper would suit your needs." Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "Cheaper?" "Yeah," Harper said, his eyes scanning Nicholas's clothes. "You know, budget-friendly stuff. Not everyone needs top-of-the-line equipment." Nicholas stared at Harper for a long moment. The man's words hung in the air like a bad smell, sharp and unmistakable. Nicholas could feel the assumptions thickening the space between them, assumptions about his finances, his intentions, and who he must be. Calmly, Nicholas placed the drill set back on the counter. "I didn't ask for cheaper options. I asked if this was your full range." Harper's smile tightened, forced and awkward. "I'm just trying to help some customers get in over their heads. Don't want you wasting money you don't have." Nicholas's jaw clenched, but his expression remained neutral. He'd seen this before, the quiet condescension, the belief that someone like him couldn't possibly belong in a store like this, let alone be capable of investing in property. "I'll decide what I can afford," Nicholas said evenly, his voice carrying just enough weight to make Harper blink. "Do you have someone here who can answer my question, or should I take my business elsewhere?" Harper's face reddened slightly. "There's no need for that. I'll show you the rest of our selection." Nicholas followed him silently to the back of the store, observing how Harper's discomfort grew with each step. The man tried to hide it, but his posture had changed, stiff and tense. Nicholas had no intention of buying anything. He already had contractors and suppliers lined up. This visit was a test, and Harper had already failed. When they reached the higher-end tools, Harper gestured half-heartedly. "These are the premium sets, but like I said, I'll take this one," Nicholas interrupted, pointing to the most expensive drill kit on the shelf, and the matching tool set. Harper blinked. "That's over $500. Nicholas reached into his back pocket, pulling out a sleek black wallet. "I didn't ask for the price, ring it up." Harper hesitated, clearly struggling with the contradiction playing out in front of him. Nicholas held his gaze, unblinking. After a moment, Harper turned and led the way back to the counter. As Nicholas handed over his platinum card, Harper avoided eye contact. The swipe of the card was quick, the receipt printed with an awkward hum. Harper placed the bagged tools on the counter with stiff hands. "Thank you for your business." Nicholas tucked the receipt into his wallet, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're welcome." As he turned to leave, Harper muttered again, this time too low for Nicholas to catch. Outside, Nicholas stood on the sidewalk, looking back at the hardware store. A hollow anger sat in his chest, heavy and familiar. This wasn't about tools or money. It was about something much deeper. Assumptions, prejudice, and quiet disrespect. It all added up to a town that still had a long way to go. But Nicholas wasn't finished yet. Today, he was just a customer. Tomorrow, the town would learn exactly who he was. The sleepy hum of Pinewood's courthouse grew louder as Langston Brooks pushed through the tall wooden doors. The morning sunlight poured in behind him, turning the marble floors into a patchwork of gold and shadow. It was just after 8 a.m., and the courthouse lobby was already alive with quiet conversations, the shuffle of paperwork, and the clipped footsteps of attorneys hurrying toward their next cases. Langston paused at the entrance, adjusting the cuffs of his neatly pressed navy suit. He had a habit of rolling his sleeves up whenever he worked, a subtle contrast to the formality of his appearance. At 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet confidence, Langston could easily command a room without raising his voice. And yet, he had mastered the art of blending in when he wanted to. It wasn't a skill he enjoyed using, but today, it was necessary. Langston Brooks was a somebody, a man who had built a reputation on fairness, grit, and relentless hard work. As one of the most accomplished criminal defense attorneys in the state, he had fought cases that made national headlines. Taking on clients others would shy away from. Justice, he believed, wasn't just a word tossed around in courtrooms. It was a responsibility, one he took seriously, no matter who was sitting across from him. And yet, here he was in Pinewood, a quiet southern town with a courthouse that still carried the weight of its past. A town where his name held no recognition, and his face would be seen as just another outsider's. "Morning, sir. Can I help you?" The voice belonged to a younger deputy posted at the security checkpoint. He was tall, lanky, and trying too hard to project authority, his pale hand resting just a little too close to his utility belt. Langston caught the flicker of hesitation in the deputy's eyes as they scanned over him. He was dressed as sharply as any lawyer, carrying a sleek leather briefcase that practically screamed success. Yet Langston had seen that look before, a thin veil of uncertainty that lingered a little too long. Langston smiled politely, reaching into his jacket to retrieve his identification. "Good morning, I'm Langston Brooks, here to observe the pretrial hearing for Willis v. State. I'm assisting as advisory counsel." The deputy glanced at the ID briefly, before his expression stiffened into something unreadable. Langston didn't miss the way the man's gaze flicked over him once more, pausing just long enough to irritate. "Go ahead," the deputy said finally, waving Langston through as though it were an afterthought. "Courtroom 3's upstairs." "Appreciate it." Langston pocketed his ID and moved toward the staircase, feeling the eyes of the deputy follow him. It wasn't overt. It never was. It was subtle. Like an itch you couldn't scratch, a weight on your shoulders that you'd carried for so long, you almost didn't notice anymore. Almost. As Langston ascended the marble staircase, he took in the courthouse's grandeur. The building was a testament to old Southern architecture. High ceilings, stained glass windows, and heavy wooden banisters polished to a shine. On the surface, it spoke of history and tradition, but history wasn't always a comfort in towns like this. When Langston reached courtroom 3, the scene was already in motion. Inside, the benches were sparsely filled, mostly by curious locals and reporters whose pens scratched against notepads as they prepared for another small-town drama. The judge's bench loomed at the front, flanked by the state flag and an aged portrait of a stern-faced man in black robes. Langston spotted a seat toward the back and slipped into it unnoticed. He preferred to observe quietly at first, gathering details like an investigator at a crime scene. That was his strength: patience, observation, and timing. The room settled as the bailiff called for order. "All rise, court is now in session, the Honorable Judge Peters presiding." Judge Peters entered the courtroom, a thin man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed back meticulously. His reputation preceded him, even if Langston hadn't met the man personally. Tough on defendants, lenient toward prosecutors, a pattern as old as the courthouse itself. Langston watched as the case began, his mind dissecting every move. The defendant, a young black man named Eric Willis, sat at the defense table, looking out of place in his ill-fitting suit. He couldn't have been older than 20. His eyes darted nervously across the room as the prosecutor launched into his opening statement, his words heavy with insinuations but light on actual facts. Langston's jaw tightened slightly. Same story, different town. The case was supposed to be simple, a burglary charge against Eric. But Langston had seen enough in his career to know when something was off. The arrest report he'd reviewed the night before was riddled with inconsistencies, and the officer who wrote it, Daniels, had a familiar name. Langston didn't need to dig deep to connect the dots. As the prosecutor droned on, Langston's attention drifted to the gallery. He noticed a handful of faces watching the proceedings intently, their expressions hard to read. Near the front, an older white man sat with his arms crossed, his face set in a deep frown as though the very presence of Eric Willis offended him. Next to him, a woman leaned over to whisper something, her gaze flicking briefly toward Langston before returning to the front. "They've noticed me," he thought. It wasn't unusual. He stood out without trying to. Too confident, too composed for someone who looked like him to fit easily into their expectations. The thought didn't bother Langston. He was used to it. What mattered was getting Eric Willis a fair trial, and right now, fair was the last word he'd use to describe what was happening in that courtroom. During a brief recess, Langston rose and stepped into the hallway. His mind was already turning over arguments, strategies, anything he could share with Eric's appointed attorney to push back against the prosecution's flimsy case. "Excuse me, sir." Langston turned to find a stocky man in uniform approaching him. Officer Daniels. Langston recognized him immediately. The officer's smug expression and purposeful stride said everything Langston needed to know. "You with the defense?" Daniels asked, his tone casual but pointed. Langston met his gaze evenly. "I'm here as advisory counsel." Daniels gave a tight, dismissive smile. "Just curious, haven't seen you around here before?" "I'm sure you haven't," Langston replied smoothly, refusing to give the man any satisfaction. Daniels stepped closer, the fake smile never leaving his face. "You know, folks here don't take kindly to outsiders sticking their noses in where they don't belong." Langston felt the weight of the statement hang in the air, more warning than observation, but he refused to react. "I go where I'm needed, Officer Daniels." Daniels studied him for a moment, clearly irritated that Langston hadn't taken the bait. With a quiet scoff, the officer turned and strode back down the hallway, his heavy boots echoing against the marble. Langston exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He'd dealt with men like Daniels before. Officers who wore their authority like a badge of arrogance, believing their word was law. Men like Daniels didn't intimidate him. Still, Langston couldn't shake the feeling that this case ran deeper than it appeared. Eric Willis wasn't just a defendant to Daniels, he was a target. And now, Langston realized, so was he. Stepping back into the courtroom, Langston's mind was clear. "They're not ready for me," he thought. But they would be soon. This opening establishes Langston Brooks as a powerful, confident, and relatable protagonist who carries the weight of systemic challenges with grace and poise. The tension is introduced subtly through microaggressions and Daniels' overt warning, setting up the brewing conflict to come. Langston Brooks sat quietly at the back of the courtroom, his gaze fixed on the defense table where Eric Willis shifted nervously in his chair. The young man's public defender, a fresh-faced attorney named Ethan Moss, leafed through his notes, sweat gathering at his temple, despite the air conditioning humming softly in the background. Langston had seen this play out too many times before. An inexperienced attorney struggling to keep up while the system moved against his client like an unstoppable tide. Ethan was trying, but his efforts were already crumbling under the prosecutor's confidence and the quiet hostility radiating from Judge Peters' bench. When the bailiff called for the next witness, Officer Daniels swaggered toward the stand. His uniform looked freshly pressed, his badge gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. Langston could almost hear the smug confidence in his footsteps. Daniels took the oath without hesitation, his eyes sweeping across the room until they landed on Langston. The corner of his mouth curled into a smirk, a taunt barely disguised as professionalism. Langston held his gaze for a moment, refusing to flinch, before leaning back in his seat. He could feel his patience thinning, like a wire pulled taut. "Officer Daniels," the prosecutor began, rising to his full height and straightening his tie, "please recount the events of the night of March 17th, when the defendant, Eric Willis, was apprehended." Daniels cleared his throat, his tone practiced and even. "I received a call about a break-in at Lambert's hardware store around 11:30 p.m. I arrived on the scene and found Mr. Willis in the alley behind the building. He matched the description given by the store owner, so I took him into custody." "Was the defendant carrying any stolen goods when you found him?" the prosecutor asked. Daniels paused just long enough to be dramatic. "He had a screwdriver in his pocket and he looked suspicious." Langston's brow furrowed. He heard the unspoken words, "because he's black," slip through that pause like a ghost. The prosecutor nodded solemnly, as though the existence of a tool in Eric's pocket was an open and shut case. "Suspicious," he repeated, emphasizing the word like it carried the weight of a confession. Langston glanced at Eric, whose head was bowed, shoulders slumped forward, as though he was trying to disappear into the chair. Langston's jaw clenched. He had seen the arrest report. Eric worked part-time as a handyman, a fact Daniels conveniently left out. When the prosecutor finished his questioning, Ethan rose, his voice wavering slightly as he tried to inject confidence into his tone. "Officer Daniels," he began, "you said Eric Willis matched the description given by the store owner. Could you clarify what that description was?" Daniels' mouth twitched slightly. "Male, dark-skinned, around 6 feet tall, wearing a hooded sweatshirt." "That's all." Daniels shrugged. "That's all I needed. He fit the bill." Langston shifted forward in his seat, biting back a comment. "Fit the bill." The phrase echoed in his mind, heavy with implications. It wasn't evidence. It was laziness. Prejudice wrapped in police jargon. Ethan tried to press further. "And did Mr. Willis attempt to flee or resist arrest?" Daniels narrowed his eyes slightly, his answer clipped. "No." "And did you find any stolen property on his person or nearby?" Daniels shifted in his seat. "Not at the time." Langston caught it immediately, the hedging, the slight emphasis on "at the time." It was a breadcrumb the prosecutor would use later to suggest Eric must have stashed the stolen goods elsewhere. Ethan hesitated before pushing forward, his voice wavering. "Officer Daniels, are you aware that Mr. Willis works part-time as a handyman? That the screwdriver in question was one of his work tools?" Daniels' expression hardened. "I didn't know that at the time. I acted on the information I had." A suspicious man behind a store after hours is enough cause to make an arrest. The prosecutor smirked, clearly pleased. "No further questions, Your Honor." Langston felt frustration coil in his chest as Ethan sat down, looking defeated. Daniels' testimony had planted just enough doubt to paint Eric as guilty in the minds of the jury. Langston knew the young man didn't stand a chance unless someone stepped in to dismantle the facade Daniels had just constructed. The hallway encounter. The recess couldn't come soon enough. Langston stepped out of the courtroom, needing a moment to collect his thoughts. He pulled his phone from his pocket, scrolling through his notes as the sounds of quiet conversations echoed through the narrow hall. "Mr. Brooks," a voice drawled behind him. Langston turned slowly, already recognizing the voice. Officer Daniels stood a few feet away, arms crossed over his chest, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. "I figured I'd see you snooping around here eventually," Daniels said. "A big-shot lawyer like yourself doesn't usually care about small-town cases like this." Langston remained calm, pocketing his phone. "I care about justice, Officer Daniels, no matter where it's happening or not happening." Daniel's smile faltered for just a second before he masked it with a dismissive laugh. You don't know what you're talking about. The kid's guilty, plain and simple. He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Wrong place at the wrong time, Langston repeated, his voice like steel. Or just the wrong color in your eyes? Daniels's expression darkened, his smug veneer cracking. Watch yourself, counselor. Langston stepped closer, keeping his voice low but pointed. No. You watch yourself. I've seen the arrest report, Daniels. It doesn't add up. You profiled Eric Willis, and now you're twisting the story to make him look guilty. That's not justice, it's abuse of power. Daniel's lip curled. You don't belong here. Brooks people like you think you can waltz into places like this and tell us how to do our jobs. Langston's calm never wavered, but inside, his frustration burned like a low fire. People like you. The words were sharp enough to sting, but Langston refused to give Daniels the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he straightened his shoulders, his voice quiet and firm. The truth always comes out, Daniels. You can fight it all you want, but the facts don't lie, and neither do I. For a moment, Daniels said nothing, his jaw tight as though he was holding back another insult. Then, without another word, he turned on his heel and strode down the hallway. Langston exhaled slowly, forcing himself to loosen his clenched fists. He'd spent years honing his ability to stay composed in moments like this, but it never got easier. The weight of the prejudice was always there, pressing down like invisible hands. The judge's chambers. Later that afternoon, Langston requested a private meeting with Judge Peters. He wasn't one to bypass protocol, but he could see where the case was heading, and Eric's defense attorney wasn't strong enough to fight it alone. Judge Peters's office was small and cluttered, with books stacked precariously on every surface. The man himself sat behind his desk, peering over his glasses as Langston entered. Mr. Brooks, Judge Peters said, his tone polite but clipped. To what do I owe the pleasure? Langston set his briefcase on a chair, his expression calm. Your Honor, I'd like to request the opportunity to speak on behalf of the defendant, Eric Willis, as advisory counsel. The judge's brows rose. You're not on record as his attorney, Mr. Brooks. I'm aware, but I believe Eric is being railroaded, Langston said, keeping his tone professional. There are glaring inconsistencies in Officer Daniels' testimony, and the arrest report. I'd like the chance to address them properly. The judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. Mr. Brooks, you're an outsider here. I understand your concern, but this is a straightforward case. Young man caught near the scene of a crime. Circumstantial, yes, but not unreasonable. Langston bit back his frustration. With all due respect, Your Honor, circumstantial evidence isn't enough to ruin a man's life. Judge Peters frowned, clearly irritated. I'll consider your request, but don't expect any favors. I run my courtroom by the book. Langston held his ground. I wouldn't expect anything less, Your Honor. As Langston left the chambers, he couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. He had known it wouldn't be easy. The biases, the dismissiveness, the quiet hostility. But now, it was personal. Daniels had targeted Eric, and the system was helping him get away with it. Langston stopped by the defense table to speak quietly with Ethan Moss, sharing his concerns and offering strategies to address Daniels' testimony. Ethan nodded nervously, clearly grateful for Langston's help. As he left the courtroom that evening, Langston glanced back at Eric, who sat alone, his hands trembling in his lap. The young man looked so small in that room, so insignificant to a system designed to overlook him. Langston tightened his grip on his briefcase and walked out into the fading light. He wouldn't let this stand. The fight had only just begun. Langston sat in his car outside the courthouse, hands resting on the steering wheel as the evening shadows stretched long across the pavement. His phone buzzed for the 5th time, and he finally glanced at the screen. It was Mitchell, the public defender's office investigator who had been combing through Daniels' record at Langston's request. We need to talk, Mitchell said urgently when Langston answered. I found something. What is it? Langston straightened in his seat, his pulse quickening. Daniels' arrest reports over the last year, patterns as clear as day. Every single suspicious individual he's picked up matches the same profile, black or Hispanic men, often young, and usually no evidence tying them to the crimes, Half the charges get dropped because they don't stick. Langston's fingers tightened around the phone. And the other half? Mitchell's tone darkened. The defendants plead out low income, public defenders stretched thin. Same story every time. Daniels knows they don't have the resources to fight back, so he stacks up minor charges to pressure them. Langston exhaled slowly, the anger building inside him like a slow, rolling wave. You're saying this isn't just about Eric Willis, Daniels is systematically profiling and railroading people. That's exactly what I'm saying, Mitchell replied. It's deliberate, and the department either doesn't care or doesn't want to know I sent you everything I have. It's all there. Langston nodded, his mind racing. Thanks, Mitchell. I owe you one. He ended the call, opened the email on his phone, and quickly scanned the evidence Mitchell had compiled. Arrest reports, incident logs, officer complaints. Enough to paint a damning picture of Daniels' pattern of misconduct. Langston knew this was a game changer, but he also knew exposing Daniels wouldn't be easy. If Daniels had gone unchecked this long, someone was protecting him, and that meant taking Daniels down would mean going up against a much larger, entrenched system. The next morning, Langston arrived at the courthouse early, his briefcase in hand, and his steps purposeful. He had spent most of the night strategizing, weaving Mitchell's evidence into his argument, and preparing for whatever Daniels and his allies might throw at him. He had barely made it inside when he saw Daniels waiting for him near the courtroom doors, flanked by 2 officers. Daniels's smirk was back, sharper than ever. "Counselor Brooks," Daniels drawled, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "I hear you've been sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Langston met his gaze coolly. "I've been doing what you clearly refuse to do. Pursuing justice." Daniels' smirk twitched, the facade cracking just enough for Langston to see the anger underneath. "Careful, counselor, people in your position can lose their reputation real fast. All it takes is one mistake." Langston arched a brow. "Is that a threat, Officer Daniels?" Daniels took a step closer, his voice low enough that only Langston could hear. "It's a warning, back off, or you'll regret it." Before Langston could respond, he heard the clatter of footsteps behind him. The bailiff approached, his face tight with discomfort. "Mr. Brooks, Judge Peters wants to see you in his chambers now." Langston glanced back at Daniels, whose smirk had returned in full force. A knot of unease tightened in Langston's chest as he followed the bailiff down the narrow hallway. Judge Peters was already seated when Langston entered, his expression unreadable. Daniels stood in the corner, arms crossed, looking far too smug. 2 senior officers were also present, their uniforms crisp, their faces stone cold. "Mr. Brooks," Peters began, his voice carrying an air of weary authority, "there have been some allegations brought to my attention about your conduct in this case." Langston frowned. "Allegations? What kind of allegations, Your Honor?" One of the senior officers stepped forward, his tone clipped and formal. "We've received reports that you've been tampering with witnesses and attempting to interfere with an ongoing police investigation. These are serious accusations." Langston's stomach dropped, but he didn't let it show. "That's absurd," he said calmly. "I've done nothing of the sort." "Then explain this," Daniels interjected, holding up a printed email, one Langston immediately recognized. It was one of Mitchell's reports, with sensitive details about Daniels' arrests and potential misconduct. Langston's blood ran cold. "Where did you get that?" "That's not the question, counselor," Judge Peters said sharply, his gaze hardening. "The question is whether this is evidence of you overstepping your bounds. These accusations suggest you've been digging into Officer Daniels' record for unrelated purposes." "It's not unrelated," Langston shot back, the frustration breaking through his calm exterior. "Daniels has a pattern of misconduct. I can prove it. Eric Willis isn't the first person he's railroaded, and he won't be the last unless someone steps in." Peters' brow furrowed, his patience thinning. "You're accusing a decorated officer of systemic misconduct without concrete evidence, Mr. Brooks. Do you understand how serious that is?" "I have concrete evidence," Langston countered, his voice steady but firm. "It's all there, in those reports Daniels doesn't want anyone to see." The senior officer stepped forward again. "We've reviewed the information. It's circumstantial at best, and slanderous at worst." Langston's fists clenched at his sides. "Then let the facts speak for themselves. If Daniels has nothing to hide, why is he so desperate to bury this?" That's enough, Judge Peters snapped, banging a fist against his desk. Mr. Brooks, I'm warning you. Any further interference or baseless accusations will result in disciplinary action. This court will not tolerate theatrics or unfounded claims. Langston looked at Daniels, who was watching him with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. Langston understood then that this wasn't just about Eric Willis anymore. Daniels had called in every favor, pulled every string, to ensure Langston couldn't expose him. The system was closing ranks. Langston exited the judge's chambers with a fire burning inside him. Daniels followed him out, his voice low and smug. I told you, Brooks. You don't know who you're dealing with. You should have walked away. Langston stopped and turned to face him, his voice calm but ice cold. You think you've won, Daniels. You haven't. You're just delaying the inevitable. I'll expose you. Every lie, every arrest, every abuse of power. I don't back down. Daniels' smirk faltered, just for a moment, before he covered it with a sneer. We'll see about that, counselor. Word spread quickly through the courthouse. By the time Langston entered the main courtroom again, whispers followed him like shadows. The prosecutor smirked, the jury avoided his gaze, and Ethan Moss looked both confused and apologetic. As Langston took his seat, the judge entered and gave a short, stern announcement. Due to concerns of interference and misconduct by advisory counsel, this court is considering a motion to disqualify Mr. Brooks from participating further in this case. Langston's heart dropped. He stared straight ahead, fighting to keep his composure as murmurs rippled through the room. Disqualify him. That wasn't just a professional slap, it was a public attempt to silence him. Eric Willis turned to glance at him, confusion and fear in his eyes. Langston forced a small nod, willing the young man to stay strong. He knew what Daniels was doing. It was a play to humiliate him, to strip him of credibility and ensure Eric's case unraveled. But what Daniels didn't realize was that Langston Brooks had faced worse, and he wasn't about to give up. Langston turned his gaze toward Daniels, who sat smugly in the gallery, his arms crossed in triumph. Langston's jaw tightened as a thought settled in his mind, clear and sharp as glass. If they want a fight, they're about to get one. As Langston walked out of the courthouse, his phone buzzed again. It was Mitchell. You're not going to believe this, Mitchell said breathlessly. I found something else. Something big. Daniels has a connection to Lambert's hardware store, the owner. They're related. Langston stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. You're telling me the break-in Eric Willis was arrested for was a setup? Exactly, Mitchell replied. We've got proof. Langston hung up and stared out across the courthouse steps. The weight of what he'd just heard sinking in Daniels wasn't just profiling innocent men. He was fabricating entire crimes. The stakes had never been higher. Langston sat in his office, the faint hum of the city beyond his window, doing little to ease the tension knotted in his chest. The file from Mitchell sat open before him, a mountain of damning evidence against Officer Daniels, meticulously pieced together like shards of glass. Every report, every fabricated charge, every complaint swept under the rug, painted a clear picture. Daniels wasn't just corrupt. He was protected. Langston rubbed his temples, exhaustion pressing down on him like a weight. Exposing Daniels meant tearing at the seams of a broken system that had buried countless victims under its lies. But Langston knew the risk they'd come for him next. The phone rang, jolting him from his thoughts. Langston Brooks, he answered, his voice clipped. It's Mitchell, came the breathless reply. Listen, I've got more. You're not going to believe this. Lambert's hardware, that break-in Eric Willis supposedly committed. It's a setup. Daniel's brother-in-law owns the store. Langston sat up straighter. What are you saying? I'm saying there's surveillance footage. Langston clear as day. Eric didn't break in. He was framed. Daniels and his buddy staged the whole thing. Langston's pulse raced. You have the footage? Not yet, Mitchell admitted. The store manager's sitting on it, probably afraid of Daniels, but I think I can get it if we move fast. Langston nodded as if Mitchell could see him. Get it, Mitchell. I'll take care of the rest. The next day, Langston returned to the courthouse with an iron resolve. He knew what Daniels was doing, discrediting him, painting him as reckless and unprofessional to strip him of his case. If he couldn't practice law, he couldn't expose Daniels. It was a calculated move. Langston passed through security, the courthouse humming with its usual tension. He caught sight of Daniels leaning against the far wall, chatting casually with a few officers. The moment Daniels saw Langston, his expression darkened into that familiar smirk. Langston approached calmly. "Enjoying your little victory lap, Daniels?" Daniels pushed off the wall, folding his arms. "Oh, I don't know. Brooks, depends on how soon they toss you out of here." Langston stepped closer, his voice low but unshakable. "I know about Lambert's hardware, I know about your brother-in-law, and I know Eric Willis didn't break in." Daniels' smirk faltered, a flash of something, fear perhaps, flickering across his face. It was gone, just as quickly. "You're grasping at straws, counselor. No one's gonna believe you." Langston leaned in, his voice razor-sharp. "They will when they see the footage." Daniels' jaw tightened, his facade cracking ever so slightly. "Careful, Brooks. You keep pushing, and you might just end up in a worse spot than your client." Langston didn't flinch. "Is that another threat, Officer Daniels? Because every word you say digs a deeper hole." Before Daniels could respond, the courtroom doors swung open, and Judge Peter's bailiff motioned for Langston to enter. "Mr. Brooks, the judge is ready for you." Langston straightened his tie, his gaze still locked with Daniels. "See you in court, officer." Inside the courtroom, Langston could feel the weight of every stare as he approached the defense table. He placed his briefcase down with deliberate calm, though his nerves hummed like live wires beneath his skin. Eric Willis sat nearby, his face a mixture of fear and confusion. Langston gave him a reassuring nod. Judge Peters entered moments later, his gavel striking like a shot fired into the silent room. "This court will now address concerns brought against Counselor Langston Brooks regarding potential misconduct." Langston's spine stiffened as the prosecutor, a smarmy man named Ridley, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, it has come to our attention that Mr. Brooks has been conducting a personal investigation into Officer Daniels, one that appears to cross ethical boundaries." Peters frowned, his gaze locking onto Langston. "Mr. Brooks, how do you respond to this allegation?" Langston stood, his voice steady but strong. "Your Honor, I've uncovered evidence that Officer Daniels has systematically framed innocent individuals, including my client, Eric Willis. This isn't a personal investigation, it's a pursuit of justice." Ridley scoffed. "Unfounded claims, Your Honor. Mr. Brooks has yet to present any real evidence, and now he's jeopardizing this court's integrity by making baseless accusations against a decorated officer." Peters narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Brooks, do you have evidence to support these claims?" Langston hesitated, his mind flashing to Mitchell's words. "The footage isn't in hand yet." "Not yet, Your Honor," Langston admitted. "But then you have nothing," Ridley cut in, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Respectfully, Your Honor, we move to disqualify Mr. Brooks as counsel for Eric Willis. His actions are disruptive, unprofessional, and a clear conflict of interest." A stunned silence filled the room. Langston felt every eye turn toward him. Some pitying, others judgmental. Eric stared at him in shock, whispering, "Mr. Brooks, what does this mean?" Langston turned back to the judge, his fists clenching at his sides. "Your Honor, if you disqualify me now, you're letting Daniels continue his campaign of corruption unchecked. This isn't just about Eric Willis, this is about every innocent person Daniels has victimized." Judge Peters' expression remained unreadable. "I will take this matter under advisement. Court is adjourned." The gavel fell like a death knell. Langston exited the courthouse, the fire in his chest, now a roaring inferno. Outside, reporters swarmed like vultures, shoving microphones into his face. "Mr. Brooks, how do you respond to being disqualified? Do you have proof against Officer Daniels? Is this the end of your case?" Langston ignored them, his eyes scanning the crowd until he found Mitchell waiting by a car at the curb. Langston pushed through the throng of reporters, his jaw tight. "Tell me you've got it," Langston demanded as he reached him. Mitchell nodded quickly, holding up a flash drive. The store manager gave in. "We've got the footage, it's all here, Daniels staging the break-in." Langston let out a sharp breath, relief mingling with rage. "It's not over yet," he muttered. Mitchell frowned, glancing back at the reporters. "You're playing with fire. Langston Daniels isn't going to back down, he'll come for you." Langston nodded, his gaze hard and unrelenting. "Let him come. I'm done playing defense." That night, Langston stood at the podium in a packed press conference room. Every major news network tuned in. The room buzzed with anticipation, the air thick with expectation. Langston adjusted the microphone, his gaze sweeping across the sea of cameras and journalists. "Good evening," he began, his voice ringing with clarity and purpose. "My name is Langston Brooks, and I have evidence that will expose one of the most corrupt officers in this city's history." The room went silent. Langston held up the flash drive. "This footage proves that Officer Daniels framed Eric Willis and staged the crime that led to his arrest. It also reveals a disturbing pattern of racial profiling and abuse of power, one that has gone unchecked for far too long." A reporter called out, "Mr. Brooks, are you saying Daniels is a fraud?" "I'm saying Daniels is dangerous," Langston replied, his voice cold and firm. "And starting now, I'm calling for his immediate suspension and a full investigation into his record." As murmurs spread across the room, Langston's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at it briefly, a single text from an unknown number. "You've made a big mistake, Brooks. This won't end well for you." Langston's chest tightened, but he looked up at the cameras, his face unwavering. "Justice isn't always easy," he said into the microphone, "but it's always worth fighting for." Langston Brooks stood in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hall of the precinct, his polished shoes echoing against the scuffed linoleum. The weight of the flash drive in his pocket felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the world on its small metallic frame. His heartbeat thrummed like a drumline in his chest, but his face remained a mask of control. "Are you ready for this?" Mitchell asked, standing beside him, looking every bit the reluctant ally. "Daniels isn't going to go quietly. This could get ugly." Langston's jaw tightened. "It already is ugly, I'm just shining a light on it." Mitchell exhaled sharply and nodded. "I've got your back." They pushed through the double doors into the bullpen, a cacophony of voices and ringing phones cutting through the tension. At the far end of the room, Officer Daniels sat at his desk, surrounded by his usual group of sycophants, officers who laughed too hard at his jokes and shared his sneering contempt for outsiders. Daniels looked up at the sound of the doors swinging open, and the moment his eyes locked on Langston, the smirk on his face faltered ever so slightly. Langston felt it, a tiny crack in Daniels' armor, but he didn't let himself revel in it. Not yet. "Well, well," Daniels drawled, rising slowly to his feet. His voice, as always, carried that mocking edge, sharp enough to cut through the room. "If it isn't the crusading lawyer come to lecture us all, to what do we owe this pleasure, Brooks? Come to cry about your little press conference?" Langston's voice was steady as a steel blade. "I'm here to talk about justice, Daniels." The room went quiet. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. No one moved, but the air seemed to grow heavier. Langston could see it. Some of them knew. Maybe they'd heard whispers of Daniels' actions. Maybe they didn't want to know. But none of them spoke up. Daniels tilted his head, his lips curling back into a sneer. "Justice?" he echoed mockingly. "You're barking up the wrong tree, counselor. Maybe you didn't hear, but you're not exactly welcome here anymore. Go chase conspiracy theories somewhere else." Langston stepped forward, the weight of his words carrying through the room like a cannon shot. "I have evidence, Daniels' evidence, that you staged the Lamberts' hardware break-in, that you framed Eric Willis, that you've spent years terrorizing innocent people under the guise of law enforcement." The laughter and chatter in the bullpen died. All eyes turned to Daniels. Daniels' face darkened, the smirk wiped clean. "Careful, Brooks," he said, his voice lowering dangerously. "You're slandering a decorated officer, and I don't take kindly to that." Langston pulled the flash drive from his pocket, holding it up for everyone to see. "This footage says otherwise." The room seemed to inhale collectively, as if anticipating an explosion. Daniels' eyes flickered to the flash drive, his bravado cracking. For a moment, there was silence. Then Daniels started to laugh, a cruel, hollow sound. "You really think that's going to save you?" Daniels said, his voice rising with false confidence. "That footage means nothing. You've got nothing." Langston's voice cut through the room like a razor. It means everything, Daniels. You staged that crime. I have proof you won't intimidate me. Not anymore. Daniels slammed his fist onto his desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the bullpen. You think you're better than me, don't you? His voice was venomous, each word laced with pure hate. You walk in here with your expensive suits, acting like you're some kind of savior, but you're just another arrogant black man who doesn't know his place. Langston felt the words like a slap, but he didn't flinch. His eyes never left Daniels. The room had gone still. No one moved, no one spoke. Daniels' outburst had laid bare the ugly truth for all to see. Langston stepped forward, his voice low but firm. You just showed everyone exactly who you are, Daniels, and they'll know what you've done. This stops now. Over my dead body, Daniels snarled, lunging forward. For a split second, Langston tensed, but Mitchell stepped in between them, his arm outstretched. Back off, Daniels, Mitchell barked, his voice echoing through the silence. You've already gone too far. Daniels' gaze whipped toward Mitchell, his face contorted with rage. You're with him now. What? Did Brooks get in your head with his bleeding heart garbage? Mitchell stood his ground, his expression unwavering. No. Daniels, I just know the difference between right and wrong. Daniels' chest heaved, his fists clenched at his sides. The room watched in stunned silence as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. Finally, his lips curled into an ugly, twisted grin. You think this will change anything? Daniels spat, his voice a hiss. You'll lose, Brooks. You're nothing, nobody's going to back you. Langston shook his head slowly, his voice steady and unrelenting. You're wrong. Daniels' people are watching, and this time, they'll see the truth. Daniels' grin faltered. His eyes darted around the room, as if realizing for the first time that his shield of invincibility was crumbling. The murmurs in the room grew louder now. Officers shifting uncomfortably, whispering to one another. Some looked at Daniels with disgust. Others simply turned away. Mitchell turned to the others, raising his voice. You've all seen what he is. You've all known. How much longer are you going to protect him? The tension in the room was suffocating. One officer stepped forward, a young man with tired eyes and a hesitant voice. Is it true, Daniels? Did you really frame Willis? Daniels glared at him, his face pale with fury. Shut up, kid. But the spell had broken. Langston turned to the gathered officers, holding up the flash drive once more. This isn't just about one man. It's about every innocent life Daniels destroyed because he thought no one would hold him accountable, but that ends today. Daniels' face twisted into a mask of pure rage. You think you've won, Brooks? He shouted, his voice breaking. This isn't over. Langston's gaze locked onto him, steady as stone. Yes, it is. The doors to the bullpen burst open, and two internal affairs agents entered, flanked by uniformed officers. One of them, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward, holding up a warrant. Officer Daniels, you're under investigation for misconduct, falsifying evidence, and obstruction of justice. Daniels' face went white. You can't do this. I'm a decorated officer. Two officers approached him, and Daniels started to struggle, his voice echoing through the room in a series of angry, panicked shouts. You're making a mistake. Brooks set me up. I'm innocent. Langston didn't look away as they cuffed Daniels, dragging him toward the door. Daniels' gaze met Langston's one last time, filled with fury and desperation. You'll regret this, Brooks, Daniels shouted, his voice a shriek. This isn't over. Langston stood tall, his face calm and resolute. No, Daniels, he said quietly. It's finally over. The door slammed shut, and silence fell over the bullpen. The officers stood frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. Some shook their heads, others turned away, unable to meet Langston's gaze. Mitchell let out a long breath, stepping up beside Langston. That was intense. Langston nodded slowly, his shoulders relaxing ever so slightly. It had to be done. You sure Daniels won't come back swinging? Mitchell asked, his voice wary. Langston glanced toward the now empty doors. He might try, but the truth is out, and I'm not backing down. Mitchell smiled faintly, clapping Langston on the shoulder. You've got more guts than most people I know. Langston looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the few officers who dared look back at him. The weight of what he'd done settled on him. Heavy, but freeing. This was far from over, but Daniel's reign of terror had been broken. Langston straightened his tie, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. Outside, the storm of cameras and reporters awaited, but Langston felt steady, unshaken. He had exposed the truth. Now, it was time to fight for justice. The press conference outside the precinct was a spectacle. Reporters clamored for Langston's attention, their microphones and cameras thrust toward him like weapons. The sun hung low in the afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the pavement as the crowd buzzed with questions. Langston stood tall at the podium, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders, but not bending him. "Mr. Brooks, can you confirm Officer Daniels' arrest?" one reporter shouted. Langston's steady gaze swept over the crowd. "I can confirm that Officer Daniels has been taken into custody. Evidence shows he falsified reports, framed innocent people, and violated the very oath he swore to uphold." He paused, his voice clear and resolute. "This is about more than one corrupt officer. It's about a system that allowed him to thrive for years, that ends now." Another reporter raised her voice. "Do you believe Daniels acted alone?" Langston leaned forward slightly, the tension in the air palpable. "No one operates in a vacuum. The investigations are ongoing, and I have full faith that the truth will come to light." The crowd erupted in a flurry of questions, but Langston held up his hand. "This isn't about me. It's about justice for the people Officer Daniels harmed, and for every person who's been told their voice doesn't matter. Today, we took a step forward, but the work isn't finished." Mitchell stood off to the side, watching with a faint smile of admiration. The once skeptical detective had become an unexpected ally, and Langston knew he couldn't have done it alone. Their eyes met briefly, and Mitchell gave him a subtle nod. Langston nodded back, an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared victory. As the press conference ended, Langston felt a hand on his arm. Turning, he found Eric Willis, his face still gaunt from his ordeal, but brighter now, free of the cloud of false accusations. "Thank you," Eric said quietly. "You didn't give up on me. You didn't let them bury the truth." Langston offered a small smile, though his voice was firm. "You shouldn't have had to go through this in the first place, but I promise you, this system will change." Eric shook his hand tightly before walking back to his family, who hugged him as though he'd been gone for years. Seeing that reunion stirred something in Langston. Relief, but also a simmering resolve. For every Eric Willis, there were countless others still waiting for justice. In the days that followed, Officer Daniels' arrest sent shockwaves through the city. Headlines blared across news stations. "Corrupt officer arrested in misconduct scandal. Falsified evidence, racism allegations, Rock Police Department." Langston's name became synonymous with the fight for accountability, a beacon for those who had suffered in silence. His phone didn't stop ringing. Activists, lawyers, and victims reaching out to share their stories or offer their support. But with the victory came backlash. Anonymous threats flooded his office. Angry op-eds accused him of vilifying law enforcement. Daniels' supporters rallied on street corners, claiming his arrest was a witch hunt. Yet, Langston refused to be cowed. He had weathered storms before, and this time, he had the truth on his side. Mitchell visited Langston at his office one evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've got half the city ready to put you on a pedestal, and the other half calling for your head," he said with a tired smile. Langston chuckled, shaking his head. "Par for the course, I suppose." Mitchell sat across from him, his expression turning serious. "You did something real here. Langston Daniels isn't just one bad apple, he's a symptom of a rotten system. People are waking up because of what you did." Langston looked out the window at the city skyline, the lights flickering like distant stars. "It's a start," he said softly. "But one man's downfall doesn't fix the system. It's on all of us to keep pushing." Mitchell nodded, raising his coffee cup like a toast. "To the fight, then." "To the fight," Langston echoed, clinking his cup against Mitchell's. The ripple effect of Daniels' arrest reached further than Langston could have imagined. The city council launched a full-scale review of the police department, led by external investigators. Other officers who had been complicit in Daniels' schemes faced disciplinary action. Langston's evidence revealed a web of misconduct, overlooked complaints, falsified records, and decades of abuse hidden behind the badge. Protests filled the streets, But this time, there was hope in the voices chanting for justice. Signs held high read, "Accountability now. No justice, no peace. Langston Brooks, keep fighting." Community leaders invited Langston to speak at rallies, his words inspiring crowds who had long felt ignored. "This is not about hating police," he said at one rally, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about holding people accountable, no matter who they are. Power without accountability breeds injustice. We can't let that continue." The mayor, under pressure, announced new initiatives: independent oversight committees, mandatory bias training for officers, and a civilian task force to review misconduct complaints. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step forward, a step Langston had fought to take. Late one evening, Langston found himself standing in his father's old law office. Dust motes swirled in the dim light filtering through the window. The leather chairs were cracked with age, and the books lining the shelves smelled faintly of ink and time. Langston picked up a framed photo on the desk, his father shaking hands with a client, a triumphant smile on his face. "You fight for the voiceless, son," he had once said. "That's the job." Langston let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of his father's legacy. He had spent so many years focused on the courtroom, on the law itself. But this fight had shown him something greater. Justice wasn't confined to statutes and verdicts. It was about people, about change. He set the photo down and straightened his tie, his resolve hardening. There was still so much work to do, but he no longer carried the burden alone. As Langston walked to his car outside the office that night, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Eric Willis. "They dropped the charges, I'm free, thank you." Langston smiled faintly, tucking his phone back into his pocket. The work wasn't finished. There were still names to clear, systems to dismantle, and people like Daniels lurking in positions of unchecked power. But Daniels' arrest had been the first crack in the dam, others would follow. Langston had seen the worst of the system, but he had also seen its potential to change. He thought about the people he had met along the way, the protesters, the victims, the allies like Mitchell, and he knew they wouldn't stop fighting. Neither would he. The next morning, Langston stood at the podium in front of a packed auditorium. Students, activists, and members of the community who had come to hear him speak. He adjusted the microphone, his voice steady and clear. "What happened in this city wasn't just about one corrupt officer," Langston said. "It was about a system that allowed him to thrive, but systems are made of people, and people can change." He looked out over the crowd, his gaze softening. "This fight isn't easy, it's uncomfortable, it's exhausting, but it's necessary, because justice isn't a privilege, it's a right, and it belongs to all of us." The audience erupted into applause, but Langston stood still, his words lingering in the air. As he stepped off the stage, a young black boy no older than 10 approached him, clutching a notepad. "Mr. Brooks," the boy said shyly, "I want to be a lawyer like you someday." Langston crouched down so they were eye level, smiling warmly. "You can be, and you'll be even better than me." The boy grinned, his eyes shining with hope, and Langston felt it. A glimpse of the future he was fighting for. The road ahead would be long, but Langston Brooks was ready. The weeks following Officer Daniels's arrest and the fallout that ensued felt like a blur to Langston Brooks. The city, which once seemed frozen in its old ways, was finally stirring with the energy of change. However hesitant and fragile, news segments played daily, highlighting Daniels' corruption, the ongoing investigations, and the reforms being proposed. Langston's name often echoed through those headlines, attached to phrases like, "the man who took on the system," or "a catalyst for justice." But Langston didn't feel like a hero. He wasn't seeking accolades or praise. Standing in his quiet home one evening, staring at the city lights through his office window, he reflected on the weight of it all. It hadn't just been about Officer Daniels. Daniels was a symptom of something much deeper, a system that had allowed unchecked power to thrive, a community desensitized to inequality, and a pervasive belief that some voices mattered more than others. Langston had confronted those hard truths head-on, and though Daniels was held accountable, the work was far from done. Langston had changed through the ordeal. Once, he thought the courtroom was the only place where justice could be won. That carefully constructed arguments and cold, hard facts were the answer. But now, He understood that justice didn't always play by the rules. It demanded more: courage, persistence, and the willingness to speak up, even when your voice trembled. He thought back to the moment Daniel's mask finally slipped in that back alley. The venom in his voice when he said, "Men like me run this town." That moment had crystallized something for Langston. Racism, corruption, and abuse weren't abstract concepts. They were living, breathing threats that infiltrated the lives of real people. People like Eric Willis, who nearly lost everything to a lie, and countless others who never had the chance to fight back. As much as Daniels's arrest had been a victory, Langston knew it wasn't without cost. The backlash had been fierce: angry phone calls to his office, vitriolic messages online, and whispers of Langston stirring the pot or disrupting peace. It would have been easier to stay silent, to ignore what he'd seen and walk away. But that wasn't who Langston was, and it wasn't who he wanted to become. Langston found himself speaking more, at community meetings, schools, and town halls, addressing audiences who ranged from hopeful to skeptical. He shared Eric's story, not to sensationalize his ordeal, but to illustrate the lived realities of systemic injustice. He urged people to confront uncomfortable truths and ask harder questions. Silence allows cycles like this to continue. Langston told a group of college students at a university panel, "We can't afford to ignore what's happening around us just because it doesn't touch us directly. We all have a part to play, whether that's speaking out, showing up, or holding those in power accountable." One of the students raised a hand. "But how do we change something so big? It feels impossible sometimes." Langston smiled faintly, understanding the weight behind the question. Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens when ordinary people decide enough is enough, when we stop waiting for someone else to fix the problem and realize we are the solution. Langston's battle sparked a ripple effect across the community. Residents began questioning long-standing practices and demanding more transparency from city officials. Local activists organized forums and pushed for oversight boards to hold police accountable. People who had once stayed silent out of fear or apathy now found their voices, emboldened by the events that had unfolded. Langston wasn't naive. He knew change didn't come without resistance. Reform was slow, and for every step forward, there were forces trying to pull them back. But the seeds had been planted, and that was enough to give him hope. Eric Willis's name became symbolic of the fight for fairness. Langston worked with local organizations to establish a legal defense fund for those wrongfully accused, ensuring no one else would be left defenseless against an unjust system. "If my story helps someone else avoid what happened to me," Eric said at the fund's launch, "then maybe something good came out of all this." Langston couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride at seeing Eric stand tall, no longer a victim, but a survivor using his voice to inspire others. Langston's journey also changed him on a personal level. His mother, always a quiet pillar of strength, had watched her son endure attacks on his character and threats to his safety. One evening, as Langston sat across from her at the dinner table, she reached out and took his hand. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, "but you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders alone." Langston smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I'm not alone, Mom, I see it now. There are so many people willing to fight, if you give them the chance." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Your father always believed that one person could make a difference. I see now that he was right." The conversation stayed with Langston. His father's legacy had always loomed over him like a quiet shadow, but for the first time, Langston felt like he understood it. His father's fight had been for his clients. Langston's was for his community. And while the burden was heavy, the purpose made it worth it. Months after Officer Daniel's sentencing, Langston stood on the steps of City Hall, addressing a crowd gathered for a community reform rally. The wind carried his words through the crisp morning air, the sun rising over the city like a quiet promise. "We're here because we refuse to settle for a system that fails us," Langston said, his voice strong and unwavering. "We're here because silence is complicity, and injustice doesn't end until we end it. This fight isn't just mine. It's yours, too. It belongs to every person who believes in fairness, accountability, and dignity." He looked out at the faces in the crowd, young and old, black and white, hopeful and tired. but all united in purpose. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens because people show up, speak out, and refuse to give up, no matter how hard the road gets. So keep fighting, keep showing up, because this is just the beginning. The crowd erupted into applause, their energy a palpable force. Langston stepped back, letting the chants and cheers wash over him. This is what hope looks like, he thought. As Langston walked away from the rally, a young journalist caught up to him, microphone in hand. "Mr. Brooks, do you think we'll ever see true justice?" Langston paused, considering the question. "Justice isn't a finish line," he replied. "It's a journey, and as long as we keep walking, we'll get closer to it." The journalist nodded, lowering her microphone. "Thank you, Mr. Brooks." Langston turned his gaze to the horizon, where the sun burned brightly against the sky. The road ahead was long, but he wasn't afraid of the journey. Every battle fought, every voice raised, and every truth exposed brought them closer to the world they deserved. And as long as Langston Brooks had breath in his body, he would keep fighting, for his community, for justice, and for the hope that tomorrow could always be better than today. This conclusion ties Langston's personal growth to the broader societal issues, leaving readers with a sense of hope and determination. It emphasizes progress, resilience, and the ongoing nature of justice.